The air that hit me when I stepped out of the sterile chill of George Bush Intercontinental Airport was a physical assault. It was thick, wet, and smelled of gasoline and impending rain, the signature perfume of Houston. It had been 5 years. 5 years since I'd traded this oppressive humidity for the sharp electric winters of New York City. I loosened the knot of my Tom Ford tie, the silk feeling suddenly suffocating. My suit, a tailored armor of charcoal gray that commanded respect in Manhattan boardrooms, felt like a ridiculous costume here. It was a shield, but the Houston heat was already finding the cracks. The drive to the old neighborhood was a regression through time. The gleaming glass towers of downtown gave way to a sprawling flatness, a horizon punctuated by strip malls and water towers. Then came the familiar streets of Alif, where the signs shifted from English to a comforting, chaotic mix of Vietnamese and Spanish. This was the world I had run, from a world I had meticulously scrubbed from my accent, my mannerisms, my very being. I was Ethan Tran, now associate at a top-tier law firm, a man whose life was measured in billable hours and six-figure bonuses. I was no longer Duke, the scrawny, quiet boy from the house on the corner, but as I turned onto my childhood street, the ghost of Duke was waiting for me. He was in the sight of the modest brick houses, their lawns neatly kept but their fences leaning with age. He was in the sound of a distant ice cream truck jingle, the same one from 20 years ago, and he was standing right outside my family's home, a place I now only visited for the gravest of obligations. My father's funeral. The house looked smaller, worn down by a grief that had started long before my father's heart finally gave out. The paint on the trim was peeling and a crack ran like a jagged scar up the driveway. A pang of irritation, sharp and unwelcome, shot through me. How could they let it get like this? I had sent money. More than enough. Every month a wire transfer left my account a digital absolution for my physical absence. Where had it gone? I parked my rented luxury sedan behind a line of older, more practical cars, its polished black exterior an arrogant intrusion on the somber scene. Before I could even kill the engine, the front door opened. It was my sister Chloe. Time had been cruel to her. At 38, she looked a decade older. The youthful spark I vaguely remembered from her high school photos had been extinguished, replaced by a permanent exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes and mouth. Her hair was pulled back in a severe functional ponytail, and she wore a plain black dress that hung on her thin frame. She didn't rush out to greet me. She just stood there on the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face a blank mask. As I stepped out of the car, the silence between us was a chasm. I walked towards her, the expensive leather of my shoes crunching on the gravel. I told her I was sorry for her loss, the words feeling stiff and rehearsed. She just nodded her eyes, not quite meeting mine. She informed me that everyone was inside, that Mom was in the living room. Her voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, as if she were giving directions to a stranger. It was the same voice she'd used on the phone 3 days ago when she'd called to tell me Dad was gone. No tears, no tremor, just the facts. The house smelled of incense lilies and my mother's cooking a funereal potpourri that clung to the air. The living room was crowded with faces. I barely recognized distant aunts, uncles, cousins who were now adults with children of their own. They parted as I entered, their hushed Vietnamese whispers following me like a shadow. I saw the look in their eyes, a mixture of pity for my loss and an undisguised, almost greedy admiration. The son from New York. The lawyer. I was their success story, the proof that the American dream wasn't a complete fiction. My mother was sitting on the sofa, a small, fragile figure swallowed by a sea of black clothing. She was weeping silently, her body trembling. I knelt before her, took her hands in mine. They were rough, the hands of a woman who had never stopped working. I told her I was there, that I would handle everything, that she didn't have to worry about a thing. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, and whispered my name. For a fleeting moment, she was just my mother and I was just her son, sharing a moment of pure, uncomplicated grief. But then her gaze shifted past me toward the door, and the light in her eyes flickered and died, replaced by that familiar, weary anxiety. I knew without turning that Chloe had entered the room. The funeral itself was a performance, and I was the star. I stood at the lectern, the polished wood cool beneath my fingertips, and delivered a eulogy that brought the entire chapel to tears. I spoke of my father, a man of quiet strength and immense sacrifice. I painted a vivid picture for them, a man who worked double shifts in a suffocating machine shop, his hands permanently stained with grease, all so his son could have a life he never dreamed of. I told them how he would come home exhausted but never defeated and quiz me on my homework, his own dreams sublimated into mine. I spoke of his pride on the day I was accepted into Columbia Law, a pride so profound it was almost a physical force. I told the mourners that my success was not my own. It was his. It was the final triumphant chapter of a story he had written with his own sweat and blood. It was a beautiful, powerful lie. And as I looked out at the sea of tear-streaked faces, I knew they all believed it. I almost believed it myself. Back at the house, the atmosphere was thick with the requisite post-funeral gathering. I moved through the rooms accepting condolences, my hand shaken by men whose names I couldn't remember. I played my part, the grieving, successful son, but my eyes kept finding Chloe. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, refilling plates, clearing empty glasses, never speaking unless spoken to. She was a servant in her own home, a silent, efficient machine of duty. Later, when most of the guests had departed, leaving only the scent of their perfume and the lingering sadness behind, I found my mother in the kitchen. The moment I had been waiting for. I took out my wallet and removed a thick envelope of cash. It was $10,000 crisp, new $100 bills. I pressed the envelope into her hands. I told her this was for the immediate expenses for the funeral, for anything she needed. I assured her that from now on she would never have to worry about money again. My salary was more than enough to provide for her in comfort for the rest of her life. It was a declaration of power, a son repaying his debt, assuming the mantle of patriarch. She took the money, but her fingers trembled. She didn't look at it. She just clutched the envelope to her chest as if it were a bomb. She thanked me, her voice barely a whisper. But there was no relief in her eyes, no joy. There was only a deep, bottomless fear. From the corner of the kitchen, Chloe watched us, her expression unreadable, but her silence more damning than any accusation. She turned and walked out of the room without a word, the slight scraping sound of her worn-out slippers on the linoleum, a final contemptuous punctuation mark. The unease began to curdle in my gut. This wasn't right. The grief, the finances, Chloe's cold fury, it didn't add up. I was a lawyer. I was trained to see the flaws in a narrative, to find the truth buried beneath layers of carefully constructed testimony. And the story of my family, the one I had just so eloquently sold to a room full of mourners, was beginning to feel very, very flawed. That night, unable to sleep in my old childhood bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of my ambition, I began to search. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I was driven by a lawyer's instinct that a key piece of evidence was missing. I started with my father's nightstand. Beneath a well-worn Bible, I found his prescription bottles. There was the expected cocktail of heart medications, beta blockers, statins. But there were other bottles too, hidden behind the ones in plain sight. Oxycodone. Fentanyl patches. These weren't for a weak heart. These were for agonizing, relentless pain. The kind of pain that grinds a person down to nothing. My narrative of a father working tirelessly until the end began to fray. Next, I went to my mother's room. She was asleep, her breathing shallow, the envelope of cash on her nightstand untouched. I moved as silently as I could to the old wooden dresser where she kept all the important documents. Tucked away at the very bottom of a drawer beneath stacks of old photo albums, I found a shoebox. It wasn't filled with keepsakes, it was filled with debt. Letter after letter from collection agencies. Overdue notices for the mortgage stamped in angry red ink. A final notice from the bank threatening foreclosure. The dates stretched back for years. They were drowning. And all this time I had been sending my monthly checks, believing I was their lifeline. The money had been a drop in an ocean of debt I never knew existed. My hands were shaking, not with grief, but with a cold, rising rage. The image of myself as the family savior, the triumphant son, shattered into a million pieces. I had been a fool playing a role in a play where I didn't even know the plot. I confronted my mother the next morning. I laid the letters out on the kitchen table, the red ink like accusations of blood. I kept my voice low, controlled the way I did during a difficult deposition. I asked her to explain. She wouldn't look at me. She just stared at the papers, her hands twisting in her lap. She mumbled excuses about unexpected expenses, about Dad's medical bills being more than she'd let on. Her explanations were weak, transparent. She was hiding something bigger. I pushed harder. I asked her about the money I sent. What had happened to it? She claimed it was all used for the house, for bills. It was a lie, and we both knew it. I asked her about Chloe. Why was she so bitter? Why did she look like the world had bled her dry? My mother finally looked at me, and her eyes were filled with a terrifying mix of desperation and pity. She told me that some things are better left unknown. She said Chloe had had a hard life, that it was just her fate. Fate. The word hung in the air, obscene. In my world there was no fate. There were contracts, there were loopholes, there were arguments to be won and settlements to be made. You forged your own destiny with intellect and aggression. To attribute Chloe's misery to fate was an abdication of responsibility so profound it took my breath away. I looked at my mother, at this woman who seemed to have shrunk overnight, and I didn't see a grieving widow. I saw a co-conspirator. I stood up from the table, the veneer of the dutiful son completely gone, replaced by the cold precision of an attorney on the hunt for the truth. The grief for my father was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was now overshadowed by a new powerful emotion: suspicion. My family's house was not a house of mourning. It was a crime scene, and I realized with a chilling certainty that my father was not the only victim. I had been lied to. My entire life, my entire success was built on a foundation I no longer recognized. And I would not rest until I had burned it all to the ground to find out why. The air in the kitchen was thick with unspoken words. My mother sat at the table, a statue carved from regret, while the foreclosure notices lay between us like an indictment. I felt a suffocating cocktail of fury and betrayal. I had to get out. I walked out the front door without another word, slamming it behind me with a force that rattled the window panes. The sound was satisfyingly violent, a brief physical release for the storm raging inside me. I just started walking, my expensive shoes ill-suited for the cracked and uneven sidewalks of a leaf. I walked with no destination in mind, propelled by a restless anger. Each step was an attempt to outrun the phantom of the perfect family I had constructed in my head, a phantom that had just been violently exorcised. The neighborhood, once a place I was desperate to escape, now felt like the only thing that was real. As I walked, the years began to peel back. I passed the small, sun-bleached playground where I'd scraped my knees 100 times. I could almost see Chloe, already looking like a miniature adult at 10 years old, meticulously cleaning my wounds with a napkin she'd saved from her lunch, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had always been the responsible one, the protector. While I was busy dreaming of courtrooms and skyscrapers, she was grounded in the immediate, tangible world of our family's needs. A memory, sharp and vivid, surfaced from the depths of my mind. I must have been about 8. My father had bought me a magnificent dragon kite for my birthday. It was my prized possession. On its maiden flight, a sudden gust of wind caught it, slamming it into the branches of a tall oak tree. It came down torn and broken. I had been inconsolable, my world ending in a fit of childish sobs. My father had sighed, telling me it was just a kite and that I needed to be more careful. But Chloe had gathered the wreckage. She took it into her room, and for the next 2 days she worked on it in secret. She emerged with the kite transformed. She had used rice paper, watercolors, and black ink from her calligraphy set to not only patch the holes, but to turn them into beautiful, swirling cloud patterns around the dragon. It was more beautiful than before. She had handed it to me, her small hands smudged with ink, and told me that sometimes things have to break a little before you can make them truly special. I had snatched it from her without a proper thank you, too consumed with my own joy to appreciate the artistry, the care, the sheer Chloe-ness of the act. I found myself standing in front of the elementary school we had both attended. The brick building seemed smaller, the playground equipment painted in faded primary colors. It was here that Chloe's talent had first become obvious to everyone but our parents. She wasn't just good at art, she was gifted. Her drawings had a life to them, a depth that was starting for a child. Teachers would rave about her during parent-teacher conferences. I remembered sitting in the hallway listening as Mrs. Davison told my parents that Chloe had a rare, prodigious talent, that she should be enrolled in special art programs. After the conference, I had asked my father what the teacher said. He had waved his hand dismissively, telling me it was nice that Chloe had a hobby, but that what mattered were grades, math, and science. He'd then turned to me, his eyes lighting up as he asked about my debate club tryouts. In our family, there was only one path to success, and it was paved with academics leading directly to a prestigious and lucrative profession. Art was a diversion, a frivolous pastime. Chloe's dreams were treated like her drawings, pretty to look at, but ultimately disposable, to be tucked away in a folder when the serious business of life came calling. The walk had done little to quell my anger, but it had sharpened its focus. The feeling of being duped was now laced with a confusing, nascent guilt. I had been the sun in our family's solar system, and everyone else had been forced to orbit me. I had accepted it as my due, never questioning the gravitational pull of my own ambition, never noticing the other celestial bodies being flung out into the cold darkness. When I returned to the house, it was empty. A note on the counter in my mother's neat, spidery script informed me that she and Chloe had gone to the temple to make offerings for Dad. The silence in the house was different now. It was no longer just sad. It was heavy with secrets, and I was an investigator in my own past. My target was Chloe's room. I had not been inside her room in over a decade. It felt like a profound violation, a crossing of a sacred boundary. But the need to know to understand the full scope of the lie I'd been living was stronger than my sense of propriety. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was a time capsule of a life arrested. It was neat, Spartan, almost monastic. A single bed, a small dresser, a simple desk. There were no personal trinkets, no photographs, no decorations on the walls. It was the room of someone who expected nothing from life and received exactly that. It was the polar opposite of my own teenage bedroom, which had been plastered with university pennants and posters of famous legal minds. My eyes were drawn to the closet. Tucked away in the back corner behind a row of drab, sensitive clothes was a large, flat portfolio case covered in a thin layer of dust. My heart began to pound. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and laid it on the bed. I unzipped it. The first few pages were filled with the drawings I remembered from our childhood, hyper-realistic sketches of birds, charcoal portraits of our parents that captured their weariness with heartbreaking accuracy, whimsical watercolor landscapes. They were brilliant. Even to my untrained eye, the talent was undeniable, raw, and powerful. As I flipped through the pages, the drawings became more mature, more complex. There were studies of human anatomy, architectural designs, bold, abstract pieces bursting with a color and emotion that was entirely absent from the Chloe I knew today. This was the person she was supposed to be. And then I found it. Tucked into a side pocket of the portfolio was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was slightly yellowed with age. My fingers felt numb as I pulled out the letter inside. The letterhead was from the Pratt Institute in New York, one of the best art schools in the country. It was an acceptance letter, dated 19 years ago. It offered Chloe a place in their prestigious illustration program along with a partial scholarship. The words blurred in front of my eyes. Exceptional portfolio. Unique artistic voice. A promising future in the arts. See you in the future. A whole different life laid out on paper. A life in New York, the very city I had claimed as my own, a life she had earned, a life she had never gotten to live. Beneath the acceptance letter was another document. A letter from Chloe, a draft written in her elegant script. It was addressed to the admissions office. It was a letter evolving their offer. It cited family obligations and financial hardship as the reason. The date on her letter was just 2 weeks after the date on my acceptance letter to Columbia. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a coincidence. My tuition, my dream, had come at the direct expense of hers. Our parents had made a choice. They had sacrificed their daughter's future to secure their son's H's. The narrative my father had so carefully crafted of his own back-breaking labor paving my way was a lie designed to protect me, to protect him from this single ugly truth. They had picked the winning horse and sent the other to the glue factory. A wave of nausea washed over me. I sat on the edge of her bed in that joyless room, holding the ghost of her dream in my hands. The anger I felt earlier was now complicated by a profound sense of shame. I saw myself at 18 puffed up with pride, boasting about my Ivy League acceptance, completely oblivious to the silent, devastating sacrifice being made in the very next room. But as I placed the letters back in the portfolio, my fingers brushed against something hard and small in the bottom of the side pocket. I pulled it out. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, no bigger than my thumb. It was unpainted, the knife marks still visible, clearly the work of a child. It was vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. It seemed so out of place among the letters and sketches. I held it in my palm, a small, solid mystery. What was it? Why had she kept this of all things? I was still sitting there, the wooden bird in my hand, when I heard the front door open. I quickly put the portfolio back in the closet and exited her room, closing the door gently behind me. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I found Chloe on the back porch, staring out at the overgrown yard. The sun was setting, casting long, mournful shadows. She didn't turn as I approached. I couldn't hold it in. The carefully constructed composition of the lawyer shattered, and I was just a man confronting the wreckage of his family's past. I told her I had been in her room. I told her I had found the letters. She finally turned to look at me. Her face was impassive, but a flicker of something, pain, anger I couldn't tell, passed through her eyes. She asked me what I wanted. My voice was thick with a self-righteous fury that I would later be deeply ashamed of. I demanded to know why she had never said anything. Why did she let them do it? Why had she let them throw her life away for mine? I told her she was a better artist than I would ever be, a lawyer, and that she had let them destroy her. I was accusing her, judging her, trying to frame her sacrifice as a form of weakness, perhaps to lessen my own complicity. She listened to my tirade without interruption. When I was finished, panting in the humid evening air, a strange, bitter smile touched her lips. It was a terrifying sight. She told me, her voice chillingly calm, that I was a fool. She said I was just like them, so focused on my own grand story that I couldn't see the simple, brutal truth right in front of me. Then she laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a dry, broken rattle, the sound of something shattering. She looked at me straight in the eye. She asked if I really thought this was about art school. She informed me that I had no idea what sacrifice meant. She explained that Pratt, the scholarship, her dreams, those were the first things to go, yes, but they were just the appetizer. She told me to think back. To think about the summer before I left for college. To think about my father. He hadn't been working double shifts at the machine shop. He hadn't been working at all. She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of her impending revelation gather force. She then informed me, her words precise and cruel, each one a hammer blow to the foundations of my life, that just 1 month after I received my acceptance letter, our father had been in an accident at the shop. A heavy press had crushed his right arm and shoulder. He had never worked another day in his life. The money from the machine shop, the money that had supposedly paid for my future, had stopped that very day. The savings were gone in a flash, eaten up by surgeries and hospital bills he didn't have enough insurance to cover. I stood there frozen on the darkening porch, the chirping of the crickets growing louder in the sudden silence. The world tilted on its axis. My father, the hero of my story, the tireless worker, was a lie. We had been broken, destitute. So then, where had the money for my first year's tuition, a small fortune, come from? I asked her, my voice a strangled whisper. Where did the money come from, Chloe? She held my gaze, and the last vestiges of warmth in her eyes turned to ice. She told me that I really didn't want to know, but she was going to tell me anyway. The world didn't just tilt on its axis, it fractured. The serene image I held of my past, a Norman Rockwell painting of immigrant sacrifice and filial triumph, was being ripped to shreds before my eyes. The back porch, a place of lazy summer evenings and childhood games, suddenly felt like a witness stand, and I was the one on trial, guilty of a crime I didn't even know I'd committed. Chloe's face was a mask of cold satisfaction. She had waited years for this moment, for the carefully constructed edifice of my life to come crashing down. She had guarded this truth like a dragon hoarding a cursed treasure, and now she was finally unleashing its fire. She told me that after Dad's accident, there was no money. Not for the mortgage, not for food, and certainly not for Columbia University's exorbitant tuition. She described how our parents had descended into a quiet panic, their hushed, frantic arguments in Vietnamese filling the house at night. My father, broken in body and spirit, was consumed by the shame of his inability to provide, of failing to deliver on the promise of his son's brilliant future. My mother, ever the pragmatist, was simply terrified. They had made a decision. They wouldn't tell me about the accident. My focus was not to be disturbed. My path was set, and they would move heaven and earth, or in this case descend into hell, to keep me on it. I asked her again, my voice raw, where the money had come from. Her eyes hardened. She told me to remember Mr. Minh, a man from our community. He was a businessman, a pillar of the local Vietnamese Catholic Church, always ready with a donation or a helping hand. He owned a string of businesses, a restaurant, a check-cashing place, and a few real estate holdings. He projected an image of avuncular generosity. But to those who were desperate, he was something else entirely. He was a lender, a loan shark who operated under the veneer of community trust, charging interest rates that were not just criminal but soul-crushing. Our parents, in their desperation, had gone to him. Chloe recounted the scene with a chilling, detached clarity, as if she were describing a movie she had once seen. She spoke of our parents, humbled and broken, sitting in Mr. Minh's gaudy office, the smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener in the air. He had listened to their plight with a sympathetic smile, nodding, as my father, his arm in a sling, his pride in tatters, begged for a loan to cover my first year of tuition. Mr. Minh had agreed, of course. He was always happy to help a family in need. He had slid a contract across the desk, a dense document in English that my parents, with their limited proficiency, barely understood. They had signed it. The loan was for $50,000. The interest rate was 50% compounded monthly. My legal mind, even in its shocked state, recoiled. It was predatory. It was illegal. It was a death sentence. Chloe confirmed that they had known on some level that it was a trap. But the alternative, telling me that my dream was over before it had even begun, was unthinkable to them. They had taken the money. My tuition was paid. I had packed my bags and left for New York, a golden boy stepping into his glorious future, blissfully unaware of the infernal contract that had just been signed in his name. But that, Chloe said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, was not the worst part. That was not the real price. The payments were impossible from the start. My father couldn't work. My mother's job at the sewing factory barely covered their living expenses. Within 6 months, they had defaulted. Mr. Minh's visits to the house began. His friendly facade vanished, replaced by a cold, threatening demeanor. His threats were veiled but clear. He spoke of other families who had disappointed him, of consequences that went beyond mere financial ruin. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. I was a corporate lawyer. I dealt with hostile takeovers and contract disputes worth millions, but this was different. This was primal. This was the kind of fear that leaves a permanent stain on your soul. Chloe's composition finally began to crack. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a river cutting through a desert of stoicism. She told me that she had been the one to confront Mr. Minh. At 21, having already sacrificed her art school dream, she went to her office, determined to find a solution. She had offered to work. She would leave her community college classes and work in any of her businesses to pay down the debt. She would be his servant, his indentured laborer. Mr. Minh had looked at her, a young, desperate, and tragically beautiful woman, and he had smiled. Chloe said it was a smile she would see in her nightmares for the rest of her life. He had told her he had a different kind of arrangement in mind. He and his wife had been unable to have children. They were wealthy, respected, but their lives were incomplete. He made Chloe an offer, a new contract to replace the old one. It was a proposal so monstrous, so medieval, that for a moment I couldn't process it. He wanted her to be a surrogate. She would carry his child. In return, the $50,000 debt would be forgiven. My breath hitched in my chest. I felt the world go black at the edges. Number. The word was a silent scream in my mind. Chloe's voice was now a monotone, the voice of someone recounting a trauma so profound that all emotion had been burned away. She had refused, of course. She had run out of her office in horror and disgust. But the threats had escalated. Mr. Minh had made it clear that my parents' safety, and perhaps even my own far away in New York, was not guaranteed. He had insinuated that he had ways of reaching people, of causing accidents. She was trapped, cornered, so she had agreed. She signed another contract, one that stripped her of her body, her future, her very humanity. For 9 months, her life was not her own. After the baby was born, a healthy boy, he was taken from her arms in the hospital room. She never saw him again. The debt was cleared. My future has been secured. The back porch was silent. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I looked at my sister, at the hollowed-out shell of the vibrant girl I remembered, and I finally understood. I understood the deadness in her eyes, the bitterness in her voice, the Spartan emptiness of her room. Her life hadn't just been put on hold. It had been stolen, bartered away to pay for mine. Every triumph I had ever celebrated, every bonus I had ever earned, every ounce of pride I had ever felt was tainted, soaked in the blood of her sacrifice. The grievance for my father was now replaced by a white-hot, purifying rage. The shame I felt was being forged into something harder, something sharper. It was being forged into a weapon. In that moment, the corporate lawyer died and something else was born. Something cold, precise, and vengeful. Mr. Minh had wanted a contract. He had built his empire on the fine print and the desperation of others. Well, I was a master of contracts. I could read them, I could write them, and I could tear them apart sentence by sentence until nothing was left but ruin. The satisfaction began almost immediately. It was a strange, dark comfort, a balm on the wound of my guilt. The helplessness I felt was replaced by a sense of purpose. The pain was still there, a constant throbbing ache for what Chloe had lost, but now it had a direction. It was fuel. I told Chloe to tell me everything. Every detail she could remember about Mr. Minh, his businesses, his associates, the contract she had signed. The more she spoke, the clearer the plan became in my mind. This would not be a street fight. This would be a legal assassination. The first move, the restaurant. My revenge began the next day. I didn't storm into Mr. Minh's office. I went to his flagship restaurant, Saigon Pearl, for lunch. I sat at a corner table observing. The restaurant was busy, a cornerstone of the community, but my eyes weren't on the food. They were on the details, the fire exits, the employment certificates on the wall, the way the managers handled the cash. I saw a dozen minor health and safety violations in the first 10 minutes. That afternoon, I made a series of anonymous calls. one to the city health department detailing unsanitary conditions I had witnessed in the kitchen, one to the fire marshal expressing concern about a blocked emergency exit, one to the Department of Labor suggesting that employees were being paid under the table, their tips being illegally withheld. The pain of Chloe's story was a burning fire in my gut. But as I made each call using the calm, authoritative voice I reserved for opposing counsel, I felt a small, cool drop of satisfaction. It was a release valve. I couldn't undo what had happened to her, but I could start to dismantle the world of the man who had done it. Within a week, Saigon Pearl was a hive of activity. Health inspectors arrived, clipboards in hand. The fire marshal paid a visit. Rumors began to circulate in the community. The satisfaction I felt was intoxicating. It was the feeling of control of power being wrested back from the powerless. I watched from my car across the street as a closed for renovations sign went up on the restaurant's front door. The suffering in my soul lessened, replaced by the grim pleasure of a successful first strike. The second move, the businesses. Next, I turned my attention to his other businesses. I spent days in the Harris County Clerk's office poring over public records. I traced every LLC, every property deed, every business license connected to Mr. Minh. I was building a map of his empire. His check-cashing business was my next target. These businesses thrive in a legal gray area, often preying on the unbanked and the desperate. I knew the regulations inside and out. I spent hours on the phone with a pro bono financial rights organization in Austin, posing as a concerned community member, feeding them information about Mr. Minh's predatory lending practices. I didn't have to invent anything. I just had to point them to the truth. The State Banking Commission launched an investigation. The pain over Chloe's stolen child was a constant sharp agony, a phantom limb of grievance. But when I read the press release about the investigation into Mr. Minh's usurious and unlicensed lending activities, the pain receded for a moment. It was replaced by a cold, thrilling sense of justice. It was the feeling of an equation being balanced. He had stolen her future. I would steal his. The third move, the community. The final piece of my strategy was the most delicate. Mr. Minh's power was built on his reputation within the Vietnamese community. He was seen as a benefactor, a patriarch. I needed to destroy that image. I couldn't reveal Chloe's story. That was her trauma to share, not my weapon to wield. So I found another way. I started talking to people. Not as Ethan Tran, the hotshot lawyer, but as Duc, son of the late Mr. Tran. I went to the temple, to the community centers, to the grocery stores. I listened to their stories. And everywhere I went, I heard whispers of other families who had been helped by Mr. Minh, families now trapped in a cycle of debt and fear. I found an elderly couple whose home was about to be foreclosed on after taking a small loan from him to pay for medical bills. I found a young man who had signed over the title of his work van as collateral for a loan and was now on the verge of losing his livelihood. I didn't offer them my legal services directly. I simply connected them. I organized a small informal meeting at the back of a pho restaurant. I explained their rights in simple, clear Vietnamese. I gave them the number of a legal aid society I had already vetted and briefed. I empowered them to fight back. The pain of what had happened to my sister, to my family, was a deep, dark well inside me. But as I watched that small group of people, their faces shifting from fear to a dawning sense of hope, I felt something new. The satisfaction of revenge was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal vengeance. I was using the tools of my success, the very success bought at such a terrible price, to protect others from the same monster. The pain was still there, but it wasn't just a wound anymore. It was becoming a sword, and I was just beginning to learn how to wield it. The initial attacks on Mr. Minh's empire were surgical strikes designed to wound and disrupt. The closure of his restaurant and the state investigation into his lending practices were satisfying, but they were merely the opening salvos in a war he didn't yet know he was fighting. My pain, the searing agony I felt every time I looked at Chloe, demanded more than mere disruption. It demands annihilation. It required a deconstruction of his life so total, so complete, that nothing would be left but the dust and ashes of his reputation. My strategy shifted from anonymous tips to a direct, multi-pronged legal assault. I was no longer grieving son. I was a predator who had caught the scent of his prey's vulnerabilities. The days of emotional turmoil were over, replaced by a crystalline Arctic calm. Every action was calculated, every move meticulously planned. The satisfaction I felt was no longer a hot flash of vengeance, but the cool, deep pleasure of a complex machine operating flawlessly. Phase 1, the regulatory labyrinth. My first target was the intricate web of shell corporations Mr. Minh used to obscure his ownership and evade taxes. This was my home turf. The world of corporate law is a labyrinth of paperwork, and I knew how to be the minotaur. I spent 3 days straight fueled by black coffee and a burning rage cross-referencing property records, business filings, and tax documents. I worked from a cheap laptop in my childhood bedroom, the irony not lost on me that I was using the very skills his blood money had paid for to orchestrate his downfall. I discovered that his real estate holdings, a collection of rental properties in low-income neighborhoods, were all owned by a series of single-purpose LLCs. It was a common tactic, but Minh's execution was sloppy. He had commingled funds paid for personal expenses from business accounts, and failed to maintain proper corporate records. To a layman, it was a meaningless tangle. To a lawyer, it was a beautiful, fatal flaw. He had failed to maintain the corporate veil, the legal fiction that separates the owner from the company. I drafted a comprehensive, meticulously researched complaint and filed it with the Texas Attorney General's office, detailing a pattern of fraudulent corporate governance. But I didn't stop there. I found the tenants. I went door to door in his rundown apartment buildings, not as a lawyer but as a concerned member of the community. I documented the slum-like conditions, the black mold, the faulty wiring, the plumbing that hadn't worked properly in years. I compiled this evidence into a second package, this one for the Houston Housing Authority. I then drafted a template for a lawsuit that the tenants could file, collectively demanding restitution for years of neglect. I handed this entire package complete and ready to deploy to the same legal aid society I had connected with earlier. I was giving them a loaded gun. All they had to do was pull the trigger. The pain over Chloe's stolen motherhood was a physical weight in my chest, but as I clicked send on the email to the Attorney General, the weight lifted just for a moment. It was replaced by the exhilarating feeling of intellectual dominance. Minh thought his money made him powerful. I was showing him that knowledge, cold, hard legal knowledge, was the true currency of power. His wealth was a fortress built on sand, and I was the coming tide. Phase 2. The weaponization of debt. My next move was more personal. Mr. Minh was a lender, so I decided to use the mechanics of debt against him. I knew from my research that while his cash flow was strong, his assets were highly leveraged. He had borrowed heavily to expand his empire, confident in his ability to squeeze his debtors. It was time to squeeze back. I identified the primary commercial bank that held the loans on his properties. Then I began to create a problem for that bank. I used a series of anonymous, untraceable channels to feed information to a notoriously aggressive financial journalist in Dallas I knew from a past case. I gave him the details of the state's investigation into Minh's lending practices and the tenant's impending lawsuit. I framed it as a story of a Texas bank's complicity in financing a predatory slumlord. The article that came out a week later was a bombshell. It didn't just name Mr. Minh, it named the bank. It questioned their due diligence, their ethics, their exposure to reputational and financial risk. Banks are terrified of two things: federal regulators and bad press. This story delivered both. The pain of imagining Chloe's terror in Minh's office was a constant echo in my mind. But when I saw that article with Mr. Minh's smirking face next to a headline about predatory lending, the echo quieted. It was replaced by the deeply satisfying sound of his own machinery being turned against him. He used fear and reputation as his weapons. I was now using them on a scale he couldn't understand. As I predicted, the bank panicked. They would be reviewing their entire portfolio with him. His credit lines would be paralyzed, possibly frozen. His ability to borrow would be crippled. A predator who cannot hunt will starve. The satisfaction was immense. I had turned his greatest strength, his access to capital, into his most significant vulnerability. Phase 3, the social assassination. The final phase was the most ruthless. I needed to destroy his standing in the one place that gave him legitimacy, the Vietnamese community. This requires a delicate touch. A frontal assault would create sympathy for him. I had to make the community turn on him themselves. My instrument of choice was Father Michael, the young progressive new priest at the local Catholic church. I had learned that he was passionate about social justice and deeply concerned about the exploitation of new immigrants. I requested a private meeting with him, not as a lawyer but as a tormented parishioner seeking guidance. I sat in the quiet rectory and confessed. I told him a version of the truth. I spoke of a family friend, a young woman who in a moment of desperate financial need had been coerced by a powerful man in the community into a terrible exploitative arrangement. I didn't mention surrogacy. The details were too specific, too raw. I framed it as a form of indentured servitude of a life ruined by a predatory loan. I described the emotional and spiritual devastation it had caused this young woman and her family. I spoke of my own crisis of faith, of how I couldn't reconcile the community's veneration of this man with the evil I knew he had committed. As I spoke, the pain I felt for Chloe was real. I channeled all of her suffering, all of my rage into my confession. My performance was convincingly convincing because it was rooted in absolute truth. I watched Father Michael's compassionate face harden with righteous anger. I didn't have to name Mr. Minh. He knew exactly who I was talking about. The following Sunday, Father Michael did not deliver his usual homily. Instead, he spoke about the sin of usury. He spoke of wolves masquerading as sheep within the flock. He spoke of the moral duty to protect the vulnerable from the powerful, quoting scripture about the dangers of ill-gotten wealth. He never mentioned a name, but every single person in that church knew who he was talking about. The sermon was a declaration of holy war. The pain of Chloe's isolation, of her silent suffering for nearly 2 decades, was a wound that would never fully heal. But sitting in that pew, listening to the quiet, powerful condemnation echoing through the church, I felt a sense of vindication so profound it was almost a religious experience. The community that Minh had used as a shield was now being turned into a sword against him. The whispers started immediately after the service. The seeds of doubt had been planted. His social fortress was beginning to crumble from within. I returned home that afternoon to find Chloe on the porch sketching in a small notebook for the first time in years. It was just a simple drawing of a bird on the telephone wire, but it was more life than I had seen from her in days. She looked up as I approached. She informed me that Mr. Minh had called the house that morning. It was the first time he had contacted them in years. His voice, she said, was not menacing. It was panicked. He had asked to speak to our parents. He had mentioned the misunderstandings with his businesses, the unfortunate rumors at the church. He had offered to help in any way he could. I smiled. A real smile. It was the cold, thin smile of a predator that knows the hunt is almost over. I told her that he wasn't calling to help. He was calling because he was scared. He finally knew that someone was hunting him, but he didn't know who or where the next attack would come from. He was a king in a castle, unaware that I had already poisoned the well, bribed the guards, and was now tunneling under the very foundations of his throne. The pain was still there. It would always be there. But for the first time, it felt like it was in its proper place. It was no longer a burden, but a compass. It was the unwavering needle of my moral outrage, and it was pointing directly at the heart of Mr. Minh's empire. The satisfaction was no longer just a release. It was a promise. A promise that I would not stop until I had repaid every ounce of my sister's suffering with a pound of his. The walls of my childhood home seemed to be shrinking, the air growing thinner with each passing day. The silence that had once been a dull, oppressive blanket was now charged with a terrifying electric tension. My methodical dismantling of Mr. Minh's life was no longer a secret campaign waged from the shadows of my laptop. The shockwaves were beginning to hit home, and the collateral damage was the very people whose betrayal had set this all in motion, my parents. They were ghosts haunting their own living room. My father, a man whose quiet authority had once dominated this house, now spent his days staring blankly at a television that wasn't on. The confidant patriarch from my eulogy was gone, replaced by a frail, frightened old man. His crushed shoulder seemed to ache with a phantom pain that mirrored the ruin of his pride. He would watch me come and go, my briefcase in hand, a silent question in his hollow eyes. He knew on some primal level that the storm descending upon Mr. Minh was somehow connected to me, but he lacked the courage to ask. My mother was even worse. She flinched at every phone call, her body tensing as if bracing for a blow. She had tried to talk to me once, a few days after Father Michael's sermon. She had found me in the kitchen late at night, her face pale in the moonlight. She had whispered, her voice trembling, that I should be careful, that Mr. Minh was a powerful man, and that I was playing with fire. I had turned to face her, my expression void of the warmth she expected from her son. I told her, my voice as cold and hard as polished stone, that I was well aware of what fire could do. I informed her that some of us had been burned by it for 20 years. I asked if she had ever considered my safety or Chloe's when they had made their pact with the devil. She had recoiled as if I'd slapped her, a choked sob escaping her lips before she fled the room. We hadn't spoken since. Their agony brought me no pleasure. There was no satisfaction in their suffering, only a grim, hollow sense of necessity. They were not the targets of my revenge, but they were the origin of the crime. Their silence, their complicity, their choice to sacrifice one child for another had created the monster I was now hunting. And watching their world crumble was the price they had to pay to finally understand the cost of their decision. Chloe, however, was slowly, tentatively coming back to life. It was a fragile resurrection, visible only in the smallest of details. She had started sketching again, not just birds but the faces of the people in the neighborhood. She had bought a small pot of jasmine and placed it on the back porch, its sweet scent, a quiet rebellion against the stale air of grievance inside. She never asked about the specifics of my plan, but she saw the results. She would read the local Vietnamese newspaper, her eyes lingering on the small article about the investigation into Minh's businesses, and a flicker of something, not joy but a kind of dark vindication, would cross her face. The true reckoning, however, was yet to come. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a frantic, desperate phone call. It was Mr. Minh. He wasn't calling for my parents, he was calling for me. His voice, stripped of its usual smooth condescension, was thin and reedy with panic. He demanded to know who I was and what I wanted. He listed the calamities that had fallen to him, the frozen credit lines, the housing authority lawsuit, the mass exodus of his private loan clients. He sounded like a king surveying his burning kingdom, unable to comprehend the source of the fire. I let him rant, my silence a deliberate act of psychological warfare. I pictured him in his gaudy office, sweating through his silk shirt, his empire crumbling around him. The satisfaction was so pure, so intense, it was almost overwhelming. This was the fear I had imagined Chloe feeling. This was the desperation my parents must have felt. I was reflecting their own sins back at them, amplified 1,000 times. When he finally ran out of breath, I spoke, my voice calm and measured. I introduced myself. My name is Ethan Tran. I'm the son of Mai and Hung Tran. You might remember them. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. I could hear his sharp intake of breath, the frantic whirring of his mind as he connected the dots. I had just signed my name to his destruction. He stammered, trying to regain his composure. He spoke of my parents as good people of the misunderstanding years ago. He said he had helped them in a time of need. That single word, helped, was all it took for my calm to break. The cold fury returned, sharper and more focused than ever. I told him that he and I had very different definitions of that word. I informed him that I was a lawyer and that I had spent the last several weeks examining every facet of his life, both business and personal. I told him that the problems he was experiencing were not a series of unfortunate coincidences. They were the methodical, deliberate, and entirely legal consequences of his actions. Then I delivered the killing blow. I have a copy of a contract, I said, my voice dropping to an icy whisper. An arrangement you made with my sister, Chloe Tran, almost 20 years ago. A contract for services rendered in exchange for the forgiveness of a loan. I imagine the Texas Board of Law examiners, not to mention the Harris County District Attorney, would be very interested in the concept of coercion and human trafficking. The line went dead. He had hung up. I stood in the hallway, the phone still pressed to my ear, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was done. I had laid all my cards on the table. The war of shadows was over. The final confrontation was at hand. That afternoon he came to the house. His arrival was not the swaggering entrance of a powerful man, but the shuffling, defeated gait of a cornered animal. He parked his ostentatious Mercedes across the street, as if he were afraid to taint our driveway. He walked up to the front door and knocked a soft, hesitant rap that was a world away from the threatening bangs he must have used 2 decades ago. I opened the door and stood there, blocking his entry. Behind me, in the living room, my parents and Chloe had frozen their faces, masks of disbelief and terror. He looked terrible. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face was ashen, and his eyes were wide with a fear that was deeply, wonderfully satisfying to witness. He tried to speak, mumbling something about a private conversation about resolving this like reasonable men. I cut him off. I told him there was nothing left to discuss. He had built his life on the misery of others, and now he was going to pay the price. From behind me, my father found his voice. It was a weak, trembling plea. He urged me to stop, to think about the consequences. He told me that what was past is past. I turned slowly to face my father, and the full force of my contempt was unleashed. You, I said, my voice dripping with scorn, do not get to speak. You forfeited that right the moment you sold your daughter to save your own pride. My father flinched as if struck. My mother let out a strangled cry, her hand flying to her mouth. They were finally hearing the unvarnished truth of their actions, not from their damaged daughter, but from their golden son. The shock on their faces was absolute. It was the dawning, horrifying realization that their savior saw them not with gratitude, but with utter disdain. They were seeing themselves through my eyes, and the reflection was monstrous. I turned back to the trembling man on my doorstep. You have 2 options, I announced, my voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel. Option 1. You will create a blind trust. You will fund it with $2 million. It will be administered by my firm on behalf of an anonymous beneficiary. This is non-negotiable." He stared at me aghast. "2 million, that's insane." "Is it?" I countered, taking a step closer. "What is the going rate for a stolen life? For a child a mother never got to hold, I think it's a bargain. Option 2 is that I take my file, the one detailing your racketeering, your fraudulent business practices, and a sworn affidavit from my sister about the nature of your contract, and I personally walk it into the DA's office. You'll lose more than 2 million then. You'll lose everything. And you will spend what's left of your miserable life in a state prison. The choice is yours." I didn't wait for a response. I closed the door in his face, the solid click of the lock echoing the end of his reign. I turned to face my family. The living room was a tableau of utter devastation. My father had sunk into his armchair, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. My mother was on her knees, her head bowed as if in prayer, tears streaming down her face. They were completely broken, shattered by the collision of their past sins with their present reality. The success story they had sacrificed everything for had become their judge, jury, and executioner. Chloe stood apart from them by the window. She was crying too, but her tears were different. They weren't tears of shame or fear. They were quiet tears of release, the slow melting of a 20-year winter. She looked at me, and for the first time since I had returned, I saw a glimmer of the sister I remembered, the one who fixed my broken kites. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. In her tear-filled eyes, I saw it all. The pain inside me was still there, a deep foundational ache. But the burning rage had cooled, transformed into something else. It was the cold, hard satisfaction of a debt being paid in full. I had not fixed what was broken. I had not healed the wound. But I had brought justice. I had forced a reckoning. And in the deep, deathly silence of that living room, surrounded by the wreckage of my family's lies, it felt like enough. 24 hours came and went. There were no more frantic calls, no more desperate visits. The silence that followed my ultimatum was the heavy, inert silence of surrender. On the second day, a courier delivered a package to the house. It contained a single document, a letter of instruction to Mr. Minh's bank authorizing the transfer of $2 million into a trust account, the details of which would be provided by my firm. He had chosen survival over defiance. The king was officially dethroned, his abdication signed and sealed. I looked at the document in my hand, the crisp paper, a tangible symbol of my victory. The vengeful fire that had consumed me for weeks had finally burned itself out. In its place was not the triumphant elation I had expected, but a vast, quiet emptiness. The hunt was over. The monster was slain. And I was left standing in the ruins, forced to survey the damage not just to my enemy but to myself and the fractured family around me. The house had become a purgatory. My parents moved like wraiths, their guilt, a palpable presence in every room. The confrontation had shattered the last of their defenses, leaving them raw and exposed. There were no more lies, no more evasions, only the crushing weight of the truth. One evening, I found my father sitting on the back porch, staring at the jasmine pot Chloe had placed there. He looked ancient, as if the years he had tried to hold back had all crashed down upon him at once. He didn't turn as I sat down in the chair beside him. For a long time, we just sat in the thick, humid air, listening to the drone of the cicadas. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy with disuse. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply told me his story. He spoke of his own father in Vietnam, a harsh, unforgiving man who equaled love with achievement. He described a childhood where affection was a reward for good grades and disapproval was a constant looming threat. He told me he had sworn he would be a different kind of father. He recounted the immense pressure he felt in America, the quiet desperation of a man trying to build a new life in a foreign land. He confessed that when I began to excel in school, he saw a chance to achieve a vicarious success to validate his own struggles. My accomplishments became his accomplishments. My dreams became his obsession. When the accident happened, he said it wasn't just his arm that was crushed, it was his identity. His role as the provider, the strong patriarch, was obliterated. Faced with the prospect of telling his brilliant son that the dream was over, he had crumbled. He had let my mother and Chloe make the impossible choice because he was a coward. He had hidden behind their strength, allowing them to carry the burden of his failure while he nurtured the fiction of his sacrifice. He told me, his voice cracking, that the cruelest irony was that in his desperate attempt to be a better father than his own, he had become something far worse. He hadn't just demanded success, he had paid for it with his own daughter's soul. It wasn't an apology, not in the traditional sense. It was a confession, a raw, painful exposition of his own weakness. For the first time, I saw him not as a monster or a tyrant, but as a flawed, broken man trapped in a cycle of generational trauma he had been too weak to break. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it allowed a sliver of understanding to penetrate my armor of rage. My conversation with my mother came a few days later in the sterile quiet of the kitchen. She told me her side of the story, her hands clutching a cold cup of tea. She spoke of survival. For her, America was not about dreams. It was about pragmatism. It was about keeping a roof over our heads and food on the table. When I had shown academic promise, I had ceased to be just her son. I became an investment, the family's best and only chance at escaping a life of relentless labor. She admitted with a chilling honesty that when faced with the choice between a daughter with a hobby and a son with a path to a lucrative career, the decision in her mind had been brutal and swift. It wasn't that she didn't love Chloe. It was that, in her survivalist calculus, my potential for success outweighed Chloe's. When Mr. Minh had made his monstrous offer, she had seen it not as the sale of her daughter, but as the only way to protect her investment. She had compartmentalized the horror, filed it away under necessary sacrifices. She looked at me then, her eyes swimming with a lifetime of unshed tears. She told me she had lived with the ghost of that decision every single day. The silence in the house, the emotional distance from her own daughter had been her penance. She knew she had done a terrible thing, but she hadn't known how to undo it. So she had simply endured, hoping that my success would somehow justify the cost. She confessed that watching me return not as a grateful son but as an avenging judge had been her greatest fear realized. The investment had matured and it had come back to condemn her. I listened to them both, and I understood that their betrayal wasn't born of malice but of fear, weakness, and a love so twisted and conditional it had become toxic. They had betrayed Chloe, and they had betrayed me by building my life on a foundation of lies. The lesson was devastatingly clear: a dream paid for by someone else's nightmare is not a dream at all. It's a debt that will one day come due. My last conversation was with Chloe. We were packing up the house, getting it ready to be sold. We had decided together that the house itself was a monument to their lies and none of us could truly heal within its walls. As we sorted through a box of old photographs, I found the small carved wooden bird I had discovered in her portfolio. I held it out to her. I asked her what it was. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. She told me that I had made it for her 7th birthday. I had spent a whole week carving it with our father's pocket knife, hiding it from her. She said it was the last gift I had ever given her that was truly just for her, with no thought of myself. She had kept it all these years as a reminder of the brother she had once had. The simple statement landed with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just talking about a childhood trinket. She was talking about the boy I used to be before ambition had become my religion, before I had started to believe the family myth that I was the only one who mattered. I told her I was sorry. The words were inadequate, pathetic, but they were all I had. I told her that my success felt like a poison in my veins, and that I didn't know how to be the person I was supposed to be anymore. She stopped packing and looked at me, her gaze steady and clear for the first time. She told me that revenge wouldn't fix her. The money, while it would give her the freedom she never had, could not buy back the years or erase the scars. It could not give her the child she never knew. Her healing was a path she would have to walk on her own. But then she said something that changed everything. She told me that my revenge had done one thing that she had thought impossible. It had forced the truth into the light. For 20 years, she had been a ghost in her own family, her sacrifice, an unspoken, unacknowledged horror. By forcing the reckoning, I had given her a voice. I had made her suffer real. And in that there was a beginning. She reached out and put her hand on my arm. She told me that I couldn't change the foundation on which my life was built. The lies, the sacrifice, they were a part of my story now. The lesson, she said, was not to erase the past, but to decide what to build upon it. I could let it destroy me with guilt, or I could use my power, my success, for something more than just personal ambition. A week later, I stood in the empty house one last time. It was just a shell stripped of the memories and secrets it had held for so long. My parents had moved into a small assisted living apartment, their relationship a fragile, tentative thing they were slowly trying to rebuild. Chloe had used a portion of the trust to put a down payment on a small house with a garden and a room she was converting into an art studio. She was taking classes at the local community college, the same one she had left all those years ago. She was starting over. I was returning to New York, but not to the same life. I had resigned from my corporate firm. My new plan was to start a small, specialized practice, one that would use my skills in corporate law to fight for victims of predatory businesses, for people like the tenants in Mr. Minh's buildings, for families like my own. The pain was still there. It had become a part of my architecture, a scar on my soul that would never fully fade. But it was no longer a source of rage. It was a source of empathy. It was a constant, humbling reminder of the true cost of a dream. I had learned the most expensive lesson of my life, that our worth is not measured by the height of our success, but by the honesty of our foundations. And sometimes you have to tear everything down to the ground to finally start building something true.